Hey guys, just a quick thank you to all of you amazing legends that are subscribed. I could not have done it without you. But most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and like this video. It's free and it really helps our small team out. Thank you. So, what the freaky frack? I'd never thought a first date could go this wrong. Like, I've heard stories, but I always thought I was smart enough to avoid all the classic dating pitfalls. I mean, I've done the whole online dating thing before, but this one was different. Wendy was different. She seemed cool online, beautiful, kind of quirky, and into all the things I liked. Plus, she claimed to be a model, which seemed like an impressive career choice. We hit it off over messages, and after a few days of chatting, we decided to meet up for dinner. I was excited. Honestly, I didn't expect her to be a supermodel, but I thought she'd at least have that model vibe, like tall, graceful, maybe a little mysterious. When we agreed to meet at this trendy restaurant downtown, I imagined she'd look at least somewhat like her photos, minus the heavy makeup, of course. I had a good feeling about it. The whole vibe of the evening was set up to be perfect, or so I thought. When I arrived, I was a little early, so I sat at the bar and waited. The place was packed, and it was kind of buzzing with energy, so I didn't really notice anyone walking in at first. But then, after a couple of minutes, I saw her. She walked in through the door, and I immediately did a double take. Wendy, it had to be her. She was wearing the same kind of casual but chic outfit from her photos, but something felt off. She looked different. For starters, she was way shorter than I expected, maybe 5'2" at best, and a little more, well, round in the slim, long-legged model type she described. But the worst part, her face, it didn't look anything like the polished professional photos she'd sent me. It was like she'd taken one of those selfies with a filter, and in person, it was like the magic was gone. Her makeup was hella caked on, way too thick, and her hair was sort of flat and stringy. As she walked toward me, I'd noticed something that made my stomach drop. She had these thick, crusty boogers stuck to the inside of her nostrils. I'm talking big, noticeable clumps, hanging there like she'd forgotten about them. I felt my face go pale. Was this a joke? Did she not notice? Or was this some weird prank? I tried to act normal, but I was freaking out on the inside. I had no idea how to react. I mean, I'm no expert in fashion or makeup, but this was beyond just not looking like her photos. It was like she showed up with a totally different face, and then the boogers, I couldn't stop staring at them. It was so bad that I wasn't even sure how to talk to her without making it obvious I was freaking out. She sat down, and we exchanged a couple of awkward pleasantries. Honestly, I was so distracted by what was going on with her nose that I couldn't even pay attention to what she was saying. I think she was talking about her modeling gigs or whatever, but I wasn't really processing it. I tried to keep my cool, but it was like my brain couldn't stop locking onto her nostrils. And when she smiled, she kept doing this weird sniffing thing, which made the boogers stick out even more. It felt like a slow motion nightmare, like something out of a horror film, and I just didn't know how to handle it. It got worse when the waiter came over and she ordered some kind of fancy cocktail. The moment she raised the glass to her lips, she missed, and a huge drop of liquid spilled right down her chin and onto her shirt. She wiped it off with the back of her hand and didn't even seem to care. If I'm being honest, I don't think I even heard half of what she was saying after that. I kept trying to look away, but it was like every time I glanced back, it was just more weird. To make matters worse, at one point, she actually wiped her nose with her hand, then proceeded to touch the table. I know this sounds like something out of a movie, but I swear to God, it was like a slow motion train wreck. I wanted to make an excuse and run away, but I felt trapped. The food hadn't even come out yet, and I didn't want to look like a total jerk by bailing out in the middle of the date. I kept trying to act like everything was fine, like I wasn't dying on the inside. Finally, when the food came out, I tried to distract myself by focusing on my plate. But of course, she started talking about how she wanted to get into acting and really make a name for herself. She even said she had been scouted by a modeling agency once, but when she told me the details, it didn't add up. Like she couldn't even remember which agency. Red flag, right? I felt bad for thinking this way, but it was clear that she wasn't being honest about much of anything. At that point, I just wanted the night to end. But there was no way I could just cut the date short without looking like a total jerk, so I powered through the rest of the meal. When the check finally came, I was relieved. I paid as quickly as possible, practically bolting out the door and saying a hurried goodbye. I didn't even make it to the car before I felt that I could finally breathe. As I drove home, I kept replaying the whole thing in my head. What was that? Was it just a bad first date, or was I being overly harsh? But when I got home, I realized something. I hadn't even told her I'd make it home safe, and honestly, I didn't care. This wasn't just a mismatch. This was a disaster. I didn't even think about going on another date for weeks. That night stuck with me longer than I thought it would. I still don't know why Wendy acted the way she did, but it made me rethink online dating altogether. I mean, seriously, how do you go from looking like a model to this? It wasn't just that she wasn't as pretty as her pictures, it was everything else. Honestly, I felt bad, but I was so relieved to never have to see her again. And after that, I stuck to meeting people the old-fashioned way. No more online stuff for me. Wow, I can still remember very clearly how excited I was for my first date with Pete. I'd met him on a dating app a few weeks before, and we'd spent some time chatting. He seemed like a really nice guy, funny, charming, and smart. When we finally met up in person, he was even better looking than his photos. He was tall, had this deep voice, and honestly, I thought he was pretty cool. The date went well, dinner was fine. We had some drinks, and we even went for a little walk afterward. Everything felt normal, maybe a little too normal, but nothing stood out as off. I wasn't expecting anything crazy to happen, and for the first time, I actually thought I'd met someone decent. As the night came to an end, Pete offered to walk me home. I said yes because, well, it just felt like the polite thing to do, and I didn't want to seem rude. I lived in an apartment complex that wasn't the sketchiest area, but I wasn't exactly in a neighborhood I felt super safe walking alone at night. The walk was nice at first. Pete was asking me more about my job, my hobbies, making me laugh, and all that. But then something started to feel off. It was like he got a little too comfortable as we got closer to my building. I lived on the second floor of a small complex, so it was just a couple of steps up from the entrance. I could feel Pete getting closer to me as we walked, and at first, I didn't think much of it. But then when we reached the door, he didn't stop. He just kept walking toward it like he was expecting to come inside. I thought maybe he was just being polite, like he didn't want to say goodbye yet, but I had a weird feeling in my gut. When we got to my door, I turned to face him, still holding my keys in my hand, trying to figure out the best way to let him know the night was over. He didn't seem to get the hint, though. He kept talking, still too close for comfort, and then, before I could even make a move to open the door, he was right there, standing way too close. It felt like he was waiting for something, and I didn't know if it was just awkwardness or if something more was happening. My heart started racing. I'd been on a lot of first dates, and nothing had ever made me feel this uneasy before. Pete's smile was still there, but something about it looked almost forced, like he was waiting for me to say something or maybe even do something. I could feel my palms start to sweat, but I tried to stay calm. Then it happened. Pete suddenly took a step forward and touched my arm. It wasn't a casual touch either. He grabbed it in a way that felt way too possessive. I froze for a second, not sure how to react. It wasn't that I was scared of him, but in that moment I realized something wasn't right. Pete was pushing for something, and I wasn't ready to give it to him. But before I could say anything or pull away, he moved even closer. This time standing so close to me I could feel his breath on my face. My entire body tensed up. I could feel my heart pounding, and I knew I had to get out of this situation before it escalated. He looked down at me with this intense expression, like he was waiting for me to do something. I took a quick step back, just enough to break the physical contact. I tried to keep things cool, but my voice was shaking when I told him that it was getting late and that I had an early day tomorrow. I was hoping that would be enough, but it clearly wasn't. Pete didn't seem to hear me at all. Instead, he stepped forward again, trying to close the distance. It was almost like he hadn't even listened to what I'd said. He reached for the doorknob like he was trying to get inside, but I was quick enough to grab the handle first and yank it open before he could. But before I could even step inside, he put his hand on the door, blocking me. That's when the real panic started to set in. I was trapped. My mind started racing as I tried to figure out how to get out of this situation. I wasn't sure if Pete was intentionally trying to force his way in or if he was just that clueless, but I could feel this awful, uncomfortable tension growing between us. I could see the look in his eyes. It wasn't angry, but there was something dark behind it, something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't until he physically pushed me back, trying to step inside, that I realized how bad things could get. I immediately shoved the door shut, using all my strength, but Pete didn't back off. He stood there, his hand still on the door, trying to force it open. My heart was racing now. I was freaking out. I didn't know if he was just playing some kind of game or if this was serious, but either way I was terrified. I felt so small standing there trying to keep the door closed. The whole situation felt like it was happening in slow motion, but I couldn't think straight. I started yelling, hoping someone would hear me. In my panic, I didn't care if it was loud or if it would make the situation worse. I just needed him to stop, and in my surprise, he did. For a second, he stopped pushing and just stood there, breathing heavily. I didn't know what he was thinking or if he was processing what was happening, but he finally stepped back. Not far, but just enough for me to close the door behind me. I locked it fast. I didn't know what to do after that. I stood there for a few minutes trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't stop looking out the peephole, making sure he didn't try to come back. Eventually, I heard him walk away, but I didn't leave the apartment until the next morning. I called my friend and told her what happened, but I didn't tell the police because I wasn't sure if they'd take it seriously. That night was one of the most terrifying nights of my life. I've never been so thankful for a locked door. Pete was someone I thought I could trust, but now I can't even think about that date without feeling sick to my stomach. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't reacted the way I did, but I never want to find out. I haven't heard from Pete since, and I hope I never will. It's funny how you can be totally normal 1 second and then thrown into a situation where you wish you could just disappear. That's what happened to me with James. I met him at work, and at first, he seemed like a decent guy. He was friendly, always cracking jokes, and honestly, he didn't seem any different from anyone else in the office. I'd never thought much of him at first. Just another coworker, right? But one day, he asked me if I wanted to go see a movie. He was talking about the new Avatar film that had just come out, and I figured why not? I hadn't seen him outside of work, so maybe it would be nice to get to know him better. Besides, who doesn't want to see some giant blue aliens in 3D? The whole thing started off pretty chill. We got to the theater, grabbed some popcorn, and I tried to ignore the fact that we were sitting kind of close together. He wasn't exactly someone I was super familiar with, but I thought maybe the awkwardness would fade as the movie went on. I was focused on the screen, watching the stunning visuals of Pandora when I felt him move closer. At first, I didn't think much of it. People move around in theaters all the time. But then I felt it. His shoulder was brushing against mine. I shifted in my seat, hoping he would take the hint. I moved a little farther away, not enough to be obvious, but enough so I wouldn't feel like I was in his personal space. But James didn't seem to get the message. Instead of backing off, he seemed to move closer. I tried not to make a scene, but I could feel him inching toward me like he was trying to get closer without actually saying anything. It was making me uncomfortable, and I started to feel the sweat building in the back of my neck. I didn't know if it was because I was starting to feel claustrophobic or if I was just getting a weird vibe from him, but I wasn't having it. So I scooted over in my seat, trying to put a little more space between us. I made it obvious this time, moved over, adjusted my posture, and even stretched my legs out a little to make sure there was a clear distance. But James, he kept doing it. He didn't stop. Every time I moved, he would follow, adjusting himself so that his shoulder was practically touching mine again. I could feel his presence getting heavier, and at this point, I was starting to get annoyed. I didn't know if he thought I was playing some kind of game or if he just wasn't paying attention, but I could feel a weird tension building. I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't want to make things awkward, especially on a first date, if you could even call it that, but I wasn't about to let him invade my personal space like that. So I did what anyone would do in this situation. I just moved away a little more, crossed my arms, and focused harder on the movie. But it wasn't working. I could feel his gaze on me, and soon I saw him leaning in closer, his body practically on top of mine. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just a casual, oh, I didn't realize we were so close thing anymore. This was a bit much. I tried to ignore him for the next few minutes. The movie was winding down, and the credits were starting to roll. I was just about to get up and walk out when, out of nowhere, I felt him leaning in. I could see his face in my peripheral vision. He was too close. It wasn't even a casual, let's watch the credits together kind of move. No, this was him trying to get close enough to kiss me. And for a moment, I thought I was going to lose my mind. It was so abrupt, so unexpected. I didn't know what to do. Should I turn away? Should I push him off? Should I say something? In that split second, everything felt like it was moving in slow motion. I'm not sure if it was panic or instinct, but I immediately stood up and started to back away from him. I could feel my heart racing. I could feel the heat of embarrassment creeping out my neck. The whole theater was still dark, but I could see the faces of other people around us turning, hearing my movement. I felt like the whole world was staring at me now, and the worst part was that James didn't get it. He didn't back off. He looked confused, like he was shocked that I'd reacted that way. But I wasn't about to let him just take control of the situation. I could feel the adrenaline pumping in my veins as I rushed toward the aisle. I didn't even care if I looked dramatic. I just needed out. My stomach was in knots and I couldn't get out of there fast enough. As I walked out of the theater, I could hear him calling after me, but I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see his face. I didn't want him to think that I was okay with any of what had just happened. I made my way quickly out of the theater, through the lobby, and toward the exit. I didn't even bother with the car ride home, just called a cab and left. The whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly avoided something way worse. I didn't feel any better after getting home. In fact, I felt worse. I kept replaying the whole night in my head, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't reacted the way I did. Would he have tried something more? Would he have insisted that I owe him a kiss because we were on a date? The questions didn't stop. It's been a few weeks since that night, and I still think about it sometimes. I never saw James again. He sent me a couple of texts, but I never responded. To be honest, I don't even know if I ever could. That night left me with a weird feeling, like I wasn't really sure of what was normal anymore. It wasn't just the close calls with him invading my space. It was how he didn't understand when I moved away. The fact that he didn't stop trying to push his boundaries made me realize just how important it is to trust your gut in these situations. I still don't know exactly what his intentions were, but I can tell you one thing. I'm a lot more cautious now of who I spend time with and how they treat me. I never thought my first date would end like that. The whole night felt like it was from one of those crazy, over-the-top movies where everything goes wrong, except that this was real, and the worst part was I didn't even see it coming. I met Raya through a mutual friend, and we hit it off pretty well. He was this car-obsessed guy who would talk about engines and exhaust systems for hours. He wasn't your typical car guy, though, like the ones who just knew about cars because they liked them. No, Ryad was intense about it. He was always talking about the specs, the horsepower, the aerodynamics. He had this BMW M4, and he was so proud of it. I'm not even sure he ever cared about anything else. When he asked me out, I figured it would be fun. Cars are cool, right? Maybe I'd learn something. So when he picked me up for our date, I didn't think twice. We went to this fancy restaurant that had one of those you need a reservation for months reputations. I'll admit I was impressed. Ryad was smooth. He seemed like the kind of guy who knew what he was doing. We got a nice table, had some wine, and the conversation was flowing. I didn't expect to enjoy myself so much. It wasn't awkward, I wasn't bored. He was funny, charming, and he kept the conversation interesting, even if he kept bringing it back to cars. But hey, I could deal with that. I had a nice dinner, and we were both relaxed by the time the bill came. Ryad insisted on paying, which felt a little old-fashioned, but I appreciated it. After dinner, things took a weird turn. He offered to drop me off at my place in his BMW M4. Now, don't get me wrong, I love nice cars. I'd been in a couple of sporty cars before, and it was always fun to feel that power under the hood. But with Ryad, it felt like he was showing off. He wasn't just driving me home. It was as though he was letting me ride in the car just to prove something. I agreed to let him drive me home, not thinking much of it. But then, as soon as we were on the road, I started to feel that uncomfortable tension in my stomach. He was driving fast, way faster than I expected for a city street. It wasn't just the speed that was bothering me, it was the way he was driving. He was swerving around traffic, cutting people off, revving the engine for no reason. I kept trying to tell myself it was fine. He was just excited about his car, right? But the more we drove, the more I realized how reckless he was being. It started off as a little unsettling, but then it escalated. He didn't seem to care that we were driving in busy areas, where people were walking in the streets or crossing at lights. He was weaving through traffic like he was in a race, and every time he hit the gas, the car would jerk forward violently. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel my grip tightening on the passenger seat. My heart was racing. This wasn't fun. This wasn't a cool car ride. This was dangerous. I told myself to stay calm, but Ryad just kept pushing the car harder. I wasn't sure if he was showing off for me or just didn't realize how insane it was. At one point, he even took a sharp turn at full speed, and the tires screeched as the car skidded. I tried to say something, but the words got stuck in my throat. I didn't want to be a buzzkill, but this was way beyond anything I was comfortable with. Then, as we were driving down a narrow, tree-lined road, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Ryad wasn't slowing down. In fact, he was speeding up. There was a sharp bend coming up. Instead of braking, he took it faster. The car fishtailed a bit, and I swear the whole vehicle felt like it was going to tip over. I could hear the tires screeching against the pavement. I panicked. I gripped the seat so hard, my knuckles were white. I don't know if Raya didn't realize what he was doing or if he just didn't care, but at that moment I knew we weren't going to make it. There was no way he was going to make the turn at that speed. And then everything happened so fast. I saw the tree coming at us, and before I could even react, the car slammed into it with a horrifying crunch. The sound was deafening. For a moment, everything went quiet. Then I felt the rush of air from the airbags deploying, and I was shoved forward. My seatbelt jerked me back into my seat, and I heard Riyadh's voice, but it sounded distant, like he was far away. I blinked, trying to gather myself. My head was spinning, my body aching from the impact. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. I checked myself. No broken bones, no bleeding, but I couldn't shake the feeling of pure shock. Riyadh was silent for a moment, and then I heard him mumbling something, clearly dazed. I could smell something burning, maybe the engine. I couldn't focus on anything except the reality of what had just happened. We were in the middle of nowhere, and I had no idea what to do. My phone had slipped under the seat, so I had no way of calling for help. I felt a wave of panic hit me. I wasn't even sure if the car would start again. But when Raya tried to turn the key, the engine sputtered but came back to life. It was a mess. Smoke was coming from the front of the car, and the whole thing felt unstable. I was terrified. The crash had left me rattled, but even worse, I couldn't believe I was in this situation with someone who had acted so recklessly. The car was barely drivable, and I could barely think straight. The air felt heavy, and I was just trying to process everything that had happened. I had no idea how we got out of the car and made our way to the side of the road, but somehow we did. I was shaken up, but at least I wasn't hurt. Riget, on the other hand, was looking at me with wide eyes, like he hadn't realized the gravity of what had just happened. We didn't talk much after that. I didn't want to be near him anymore. I was too scared to even look at him. Eventually, I found a passing car that was able to help me get to safety. The whole night was a blur after that. I can't stop thinking about it. How stupid was I to not realize how reckless he was earlier? How could he have thought driving like that was okay? It's been a while since that night, and I haven't spoken to Riyadh since. Honestly, I don't even want to. That first date was supposed to be fun, but I never want to relive anything like that again. It was one of those days where I thought everything was going fine, until it wasn't. I was excited about meeting Martin. He seemed cool. We talked for a while, and I liked the idea of hanging out. Plus, I was starving and pizza sounded perfect for the occasion. But I had no idea how completely wrong it would all go. It's funny how one little detail can turn everything upside down. I guess I found it out the hard way. We met at this hole-in-the-wall pizza joint that had all the charm of a dusty basement, but the food was really good. I was kind of hoping it'd be a chill date, nothing crazy, just getting to know each other. I had no expectations, which is probably why this whole thing hit me like a truck. When he showed up, he was normal, maybe too normal, like a type of normal that almost felt off. But hey, who am I to judge? I wasn't exactly a prize either. So we sat down, ordered a couple of slices, and started talking about whatever random stuff came to mind. I remember talking about my favorite movies, how I hated pineapple on pizza, seriously, who eats that? And how Martin seemed a bit too quiet for my liking, but I let it slide. Halfway through the meal it happened. I was mid-sentence, probably talking about how much I loved cheesy horror flicks, when I noticed Martin's face change. His eyes widened, his hand gripped the edge of the table a little too tightly, and I thought, wait, what the hell? For a second, I thought he was just about to say something or maybe get a little excited about whatever dumb movie fact I had just shared. But no. Instead, it was like he was trying to hold something back. Then it came, like out of nowhere. Martin bent over the table, hands clutching his stomach, and then, bam, he threw up. Everywhere. On the table, on the floor, and of course, all over me. I didn't even have time to react. I was sitting there, frozen, as he kept going, his face red, his body shaking like he couldn't control it. It was like a slow-motion horror movie, and all I could do was stare in complete disbelief. I remember the smell first. It wasn't even that it was particularly gross, but it was everywhere. And then the sheer amount of it. I felt it seeping into my clothes, splattering across my chest, and dripping onto my lap. My stomach churned, but I wasn't sure whether it was from the actual vomit or the shock of the situation. Martin finally stopped, leaning back in his chair, breathing heavily, his face pale and mortified. The waiter came rushing over like he'd seen this happen before, which I guess was comforting in a weird way. But I didn't want to be there anymore. I wanted to just disappear. The pizza we had ordered was still sitting there, completely untouched now that the entire mood of the evening had just collapsed. Martin was apologizing like crazy, stammering through words as he tried to clean up the mess. But I couldn't even process what he was saying. I could hear him, but it felt like I was underwater. I wanted to laugh because this was just too insane for me to even handle, but there was no humor in it at all. It was just gross. And honestly, I didn't know what to do. The waiter left to get paper towels, and Martin kept grabbing napkins, trying to wipe it off me. But the more he wiped, the more I realized my clothes were ruined. The smell was stuck to my skin, and I could feel it starting to settle in. At that point, I was so out of it that I just stood up and started walking toward the bathroom without saying a word. When I closed the door behind me in the bathroom, I took a long look at myself in the mirror. There was vomit all over my shirt, my jeans were soaked, and there was this feeling of pure disbelief creeping up on me. Like, this wasn't happening. My first date, and it was ruined by him throwing up all over me. I tried washing my hands, wiping my face, and doing whatever I could to get rid of the smell. I even tried splashing water on my clothes, but it just made everything worse. I was about to sit there and smell like puke for the rest of the night. And yet, as I stood there, hearing Martin still apologizing in the background, I realized I didn't want to leave. For some stupid reason, I still wanted to be there. I wasn't mad at him, I was just lost. I spent a few minutes in the bathroom trying to collect myself, but all I could think was how I didn't want to go back out there. I didn't know how to handle the situation. I wasn't prepared to deal with this level of disaster, and the worst part was that I was actually kinda invested. I'd been excited to meet him, and now this? Was this how every first date went? I finally stepped out of the bathroom, holding my ruined shirt away from my body like it was radioactive. Martin looked up, his face full of regret, but I could tell he wasn't going to stop apologizing, so I just waved him off. I didn't even want to talk about it. We both ended up just sitting there in awkward silence. The waiter had cleaned up the worst of it, but the table was still a disaster. I don't even know what we talked about after that, to be honest. It was all a blur of awkwardness, the kind you can't escape from. When it came time to pay, Martin was trying so hard to act normal, like nothing had happened, but I could tell he was dying inside. And honestly, so was I. I don't even know how we got through the rest of the night. I guess we ended up walking out together, both of us pretending everything was fine. But we didn't talk much after that. We said our goodbyes, and as I walked away from him, the only thing I could think was, never again. At least, that's what I told myself. And maybe it was the pizza's fault, or maybe it was just the moment. Either way, that was the last time I ever saw Martin. And honestly, I can't even say I'm sorry about it. I mean, who throws up all over someone on a first date? That's just not something you come back from. Ah, I remember this like it was yesterday. I matched with Sami on Tinder. Honestly, at first I thought she was way out of my league, but she seemed chill over text. The conversation flowed naturally, and we had a lot in common, which is rare. She was super into food, travel, and wine, and I thought, why not take her to a nice place? Show off a little. I thought I had my life together at least enough to impress someone, right? We picked this fancy Italian place that I had been meaning to try for a while. It was pretty upscale, but not too fancy to the point where I'd feel out of place. At least I thought so. When I showed up, Sammy was already there, waiting by the door. She was even more attractive in person, and honestly, I couldn't believe she was on a date with me. She was tall, with this flawless skin and long hair that probably cost more to maintain than my entire wardrobe. But hey, I was optimistic. I didn't want to think about how much she probably made compared to me, or how much better her shoes were than mine. I just smiled and greeted her. She immediately started talking about how the ambience was just perfect, and how she was in the mood for something a bit special. I didn't really think much of it. We got seated, ordered a couple of appetizers, and started chatting about life and things like usual. Then the wine list came. The waiter handed it to us, and I figured we'd just go with something simple, maybe a bottle in the $30, $40 range. But Sami, she didn't even look at the cheaper options. She immediately pointed to one of the most expensive bottles on the list. I was like, okay, I get it. Maybe she's just really into wine, but then I saw the price. It was a $400 bottle, and she just casually said, let's go with this one. I kind of froze. I mean, I had the money to cover the meal, but I definitely didn't have enough to drop $400 on wine. I could feel my palms sweating. I don't know why I didn't speak up right away. Maybe I was nervous. Maybe I didn't want to look cheap in front of her, but I knew I couldn't afford it. I was working a job that didn't exactly pay for nights like this, and the thought of it made my stomach do flips. I tried to keep it together, even though I felt like I was about to choke on my own anxiety. So I had to say something. Hey, maybe we can just get a bottle that's a little more affordable. I could feel the words coming out of my mouth like they were made of lead. I wanted to crawl under the table. She raised an eyebrow and took a slow sip of her water, looking at me like I had just told her I didn't know how to breathe. She didn't say anything at first. It felt like forever. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, casually crossing her arms. Her face shifted, like she was trying to figure out how to respond without totally insulting me. And then she let out a little laugh, almost like she was trying to hold it in. Wait, you're telling me you can't afford this? You're really gonna be that guy? The waiter was still standing there, awkwardly waiting for our decision, and I felt that my throat was closing up. I could feel my face burning. It was so uncomfortable. She wasn't being rude, but I could tell she wasn't exactly impressed. I mean, I don't think it's worth the price, I said, trying to keep it calm, but my voice sounded pathetic to my own ears. She shook her head, looking genuinely disappointed now. I don't know, I thought you were a little more together than this. It's just a bottle of wine, she said, almost too casually. Yes, I was wrong. I felt like I was being judged in the worst possible way, and my stomach dropped. I had no idea what to say. She continued to look at me, waiting for me to act like I had some kind of solution to this awkward moment, but I didn't. She looked at the waiter, then back at me. Just bring the bottle. I'm not that picky, she said, like it was no big deal, but the tone of her voice made it clear she wasn't impressed. The waiter left to fetch the wine, and I could feel every inch of tension in the air. I wanted to crawl into a hole. My mind was racing, thinking about what she was probably thinking of me now. I wasn't even sure if I wanted to stay. But I tried to keep the conversation going, talking about random stuff, like work, my hobbies, her favorite restaurants. But it wasn't really working. Every time I looked at her, it was like she was so over me. When the wine came, the bottle looked even more ridiculous in front of us. She was all smiles again, acting like nothing had happened. She poured herself a glass, took a sip, and then smiled at me. But it didn't feel genuine at all. She was just waiting for me to pay the bill. Then the situation took a turn. She took out her phone, scrolling through something, and then looked up at me with this totally blank expression. Yeah, I'm not really feeling this anymore. I think I'll just call my friend to pick me up. I was so caught off guard that I didn't even know what to say. What? Yeah, I'm just gonna go, she said, her voice ice cold now. She didn't even try to make it sound nicer. She just dropped her phone on the table and leaned back in her chair. I couldn't even process what was happening. She didn't even excuse herself or anything. She just pulled up the contact for her friend, called him, and basically said, yeah, I need you to pick me up. I'll be outside in 5. It felt like a punch in the gut. She didn't look at me after that. No apology. No, hey, thanks for the dinner or anything. She just got up, grabbed her stuff, and without saying another word, walked straight out the door. I was left sitting there with a bill for a $400 bottle of wine that I couldn't pay for, with no idea what had just happened. The waiter came over to drop off the check, and I swear I couldn't even look at him. I felt like an idiot. I ended up paying what I could and just leaving a ridiculously small tip. I didn't even care at that point. As I walked out of the restaurant, I could still feel the sting of the whole situation. I don't know why I thought it would go well. Maybe I thought I could impress her, but instead I ended up looking like an idiot who couldn't even afford a simple dinner. I haven't heard from her since, and honestly, I don't think I ever will. Bro, I don't know why I agreed to this. I honestly don't. Maybe it was because Jamie, the guy I had a crush on since high school, asked me out, and I just couldn't say no. I mean, this was the guy who had made my teenage years a mix of daydreams and awkward glances. But now, he's standing in front of me, looking at me with that stupid smirk, asking if I want to go paintballing. And I didn't want to go. I really didn't. I wasn't into that kind of thing, especially not with him. But I couldn't say no. I couldn't disappoint him, especially not when this felt like my one chance to actually hang out with Jamie outside of high school. I had this idea in my head that this could somehow be the start of something. Who knows? Maybe he had a crush on me too, and paintballing would be some wild, fun date that we'd both remember. Yeah, I should have trusted my gut when it said, don't do this. But I didn't. So I ended up agreeing to meet him at the paintball field, hoping for the best but also preparing for the worst. I was nervous from the get-go. When I arrived, I saw him waiting by the entrance, dressed in all this crazy gear, helmet, padded jacket, the works. He looked like he was ready for war, not a date. And me. I was wearing a hoodie and some old jeans, totally underprepared for what was about to happen. Ready for some action? He asked, grinning as if this was the coolest thing in the world. I forced a smile, trying to hide how uncomfortable I felt. I was already regretting this whole idea, but I didn't want to look like a buzzkill. So I nodded, even though I could already feel the pressure building in my chest. We got our gear on and met up with some random people at the field. I was kind of relieved there were other people there. At least I wasn't the only one who looked out of place. Jamie was pumped, getting all into it, talking strategy, acting like a total pro. Me. I was just trying to figure out how to not get shot in the face. But the worst part was that he seemed to be loving it. I was half hoping that maybe once we got going, I'd at least get the hang of it. That didn't happen. So the game started, and I stuck to the edge of the field trying to keep my distance. I didn't really care about winning or being a part of the action. I just wanted to get through this without bruising my ego, or worse, getting shot in the leg and looking stupid. But Jamie, of course, wasn't letting that happen. He saw me standing behind a barricade, and at first, I thought he was just coming over to check if I was okay. But nope. Instead, he crouched down and took aim. I barely had time to react before the first paintball hit me right in the arm. It stung, but it wasn't terrible. I winced, but I tried to laugh it off. I could handle it. But then he shot me again, and again, and again. At first, I thought maybe he was just messing around, having some fun. But the shots kept coming. Each one hurt more than the last. My arm was starting to bruise, and every time the paintball hit me, it felt like a sharp jab to my skin. I turned to look at him, thinking he was just being playful. But his expression wasn't playful. It was like he was enjoying it. And when I said, "Jamie, stop," it didn't even faze him. He just kept shooting, each one harder than the last. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't fun. It wasn't a joke. It was just pain. My chest was starting to ache from the shots hitting me, and I could feel my body growing tense. I started backing up, trying to get away from him, but he followed. And then, when I tried to hide behind one of the obstacles on the field, I swear he went out of his way to hunt me down. It was like he wasn't even playing the game anymore. He just wanted to shoot me over and over. I couldn't get away fast enough. I ducked and ran, but each time I peeked out, he was there, aiming, pulling the trigger, hitting me again. At that point, I was starting to feel a little dizzy. My body was covered in welts and bruises, my arms were sore, and it was clear he wasn't going to stop. He was laughing, almost like he was having the time of his life. But to me, it felt like he was getting some kind of twisted pleasure from watching me get hit. I kept telling him to stop, but he ignored me. It didn't even seem to register that I wasn't enjoying it. Finally, after what felt like forever, I couldn't take it anymore. I ducked behind a barricade, my arms covered in bruises, and just stayed there, clutching my side, trying to catch my breath. My whole body was aching, and I could feel tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. Not because of the pain, but because I couldn't believe this was happening. This wasn't a date. This wasn't fun. This was just pure, uncomfortable misery. He didn't come after me at that point. I think he finally noticed that I wasn't moving anymore, and the game had finished. Everyone else was running around celebrating, but I could barely stand. I didn't even know if I could walk without looking like I'd been hit by a truck. When I finally made my way out of the arena, Jamie came up to me like nothing was wrong. He was grinning, acting like we just had the best time. He looked at me, clearly expecting me to be just as excited about the day as he was. I don't know what happened. I don't know if he thought I was playing along or if he didn't realize how bad it had gotten. But I wasn't laughing. I wasn't joking. I wasn't impressed. I was just hurt, and honestly, I was pissed. I could barely even look at him. The bruises were already showing up on my arms, and I could feel the swelling in my ribs. I didn't say anything to him. I didn't want to argue. I just grabbed my bag, said I had to go, and left. I think he tried to say something, but I didn't listen. I didn't want to hear it. As I walked to my car, I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. That wasn't how a date was supposed to go. That wasn't even how friends were supposed to treat each other. I never spoke to Jamie again after that. I blocked him on everything. I didn't even feel bad about it. Sometimes it's hard to know who someone really is until they show you. I should have known it was a red flag when Emma asked me to pick her up at her place for the first date. I know it sounds dumb, but I just didn't expect anything weird. We'd been texting for a while, and everything seemed totally normal. She was cute, funny, and we had a lot in common: movies, music, and random late night conversations about everything. She made me laugh and kept me interested, and honestly, I thought it was going to be a chill evening. When I pulled up to her apartment, I wasn't expecting much. She looked exactly how she did in her pictures: a little edgy, but still cute. We hugged, got in my car, and headed out for dinner. It wasn't anything fancy, just a pizza place that we both agreed on, somewhere easy and casual. I figured we'd just grab some pizza, talk, and see where things went. Nothing special, right? But things started to get weird when we got back to her place. After dinner, Emma invited me inside. I didn't think much of it. She had mentioned she had a movie queued up. And I thought, why not hang out? It felt like a low-pressure way to get to know each other better. So we sit down on the couch, and she's still talking like everything is totally fine. We're watching this movie I don't even remember, and then out of nowhere, she turns to me and asks, "Hey, do you mind rubbing my feet?" At first, I thought she was joking. I mean, it didn't seem like the kind of question that should come up on a first date, right? But she didn't laugh. She just looked at me seriously, all innocent like it was no big deal. I wasn't sure how to respond. I mean, I didn't want to be rude. Plus, I figured maybe it was just one of those quirky things. Maybe she had a thing for foot massages or whatever. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not super into feet, but I didn't want to make it weird, so I said sure. I just kind of went along with it, figuring it would be a one-off thing. So she kicks off her shoes, stretches her legs out on the couch, and puts her feet in my lap. No big deal, right? I start rubbing her feet awkwardly at first, trying to figure out if I was doing it right. I'm not really sure what's supposed to feel good in a foot rub, but I was trying my best to be a decent guy about it. She kept talking, telling me how tired she'd been from work and how much her feet had been killing her. Then, out of nowhere, she says, "Can you pour some honey on them?" Wait, what? At first, I thought I misheard her. "Honey?" I asked like an idiot. She smiled, as if it was the most normal request in the world, and said, "Yeah, honey. It's really good for your skin, and it helps with circulation. It'll make the massage better." I'm not sure if I was just too polite, but I didn't know what to say. Was this a thing? I mean, I've never heard of people using honey as a part of a foot rub. I stared at her for a second, trying to process if she was actually serious. She stood up, walked over to her kitchen, and came back with a jar of honey. She handed it to me like it was a completely normal thing to do, like, "Here, go ahead." My mind was racing. I had no idea what I was supposed to do with it. But I was still in that awkward phase where I didn't want to seem rude, so I poured some of it on her feet, not knowing what the hell I was getting myself into. The honey was sticky, and the texture felt weird as I spread it across her skin. She seemed to be enjoying it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't right. I could feel myself getting more and more uncomfortable. My hands were sticky, and I had no idea how much longer I could keep going. But then the smell of the honey hit me. It wasn't just sweet. There was something else about it, something off, like it had been sitting there for too long. It made my stomach turn a little, but I tried to push through. Maybe I was just being dramatic. As I continued rubbing, she started to relax even more. She closed her eyes, sighed, and almost seemed to melt into the couch. I don't know if it was the honey or the fact that I was basically giving her this strange foot massage, but I started feeling like I was just going through the motions. My hands were sticky, my body was stiff, and the entire situation felt so off. But it wasn't until she told me to stop, lean back, and take a good look at her feet that I realized something wasn't right. She just kept telling me to stare at them, as if I were supposed to be mesmerized. "Look at how soft they are," she said. "Look at the honey on them." At that point, I wasn't sure if I was just uncomfortable because I had no idea what I was doing, or if this was something more weird. But I started to feel trapped. I didn't want to be rude, but this was beyond anything I had imagined a first date would be. I thought about getting up and leaving, but part of me just didn't know how to escape the situation. It felt like the longer I stayed, the weirder things got. She wasn't asking me to do anything else, but the whole atmosphere felt suffocating. Her whole vibe had changed from casual and cool to something almost unsettling. I felt like I was in this weird dynamic where I was supposed to be totally okay with this bizarre request, but deep down I wasn't. I kept thinking about how I'd never even met a person who would ask for something like this, and here I was, rubbing someone's feet with honey on them like it was a completely normal first date activity. At some point, I couldn't take any more. I slowly stood up, wiped my hands off with a towel she had handed me earlier, and just said, I think I need to go. I don't even know if I said it awkwardly or if she noticed how weirded out I was, but she didn't stop me. She didn't ask me to stay or even say goodbye. I left in a hurry, almost embarrassed by the whole experience. My mind was racing. I kept thinking about what just happened. Why the honey? Why the weird foot rub? Was this just a kink or something else? That night, I went home and couldn't shake the weirdness of the entire thing. I felt disturbed, like I had just entered into some parallel world where normal first dates didn't exist. To this day, I still can't quite process it. That's the last time I ever spoke to Emma. Some things you just can't unsee. I had no idea what I was getting into when Kyle asked me out. I mean, we'd been talking for a while, messaging each other on Instagram, texting back and forth, and things seemed pretty chill. We had a lot of common interests, mostly talking about music and random stuff, but to be honest, I never thought we'd go for a date at the gym. Like, who does that? But for whatever reason, when he suggested it, I didn't want to be the one to shoot him down. I figured it'd be cool, maybe even a little fun, right? Like working out together, bonding over sweat, or whatever. Plus, he seemed pretty into fitness, so I thought maybe this was just how he wanted to hang out. Maybe he was one of those gym bros, but hey, I was in decent shape too, so how bad could it be? I should have known something was off the moment we walked in. The gym smelled like rubber mats and sweat, the usual, but it wasn't the place that was making me uncomfortable. It was Kyle. He was acting like he was training for the Olympics or something, strutting around, lifting weights like it was his second home. I thought I'd just warm up, maybe hit some machines and get the hang of things. I wasn't trying to show off. I just wanted to go through a light workout and see how the night went. But Kyle, he was all out flexing, trying to show me how much stronger he was than everyone else in the room. We started with some basic stuff, light cardio, stretching, but then Kyle made a beeline for the squat rack. I figured it was just a normal part of his routine, but then he dropped the bomb. I'm gonna go for 300 pounds today. I was confused, honestly. I didn't know if he meant he was just aiming for the squat rack or if he really wanted to squat 300 pounds. Either way, I was thinking, okay, buddy, do you? But no, it wasn't just a casual thing. This guy was actually trying to load up the bar with 300 pounds. I mean, I know people lift heavy weights, but I wasn't expecting this on a first date. Maybe he was just trying to impress me or something, but honestly, I was getting a little uncomfortable at this point. Like, we're in a gym, yes, but there's no need to turn this into a freak show. But I guess Kyle was determined to show off. He grabbed a few extra plates and threw them on the barbell, all the while talking to me like I was supposed to be impressed. I wasn't. I was just standing there, kind of awkwardly watching him, trying to pretend I was into the whole vibe. He went up to the bar, adjusted his position, and squatted down like he was about to lift the heaviest thing in the world. His face was red, and I could hear him grunting with every breath. I thought, okay, maybe he's got this. Maybe it's just one of those things where you push your limits for fun. And then suddenly he didn't have it. It all happened so fast. 1 second he was squatting down, trying to keep his balance, and the next second the weight was too much. The bar bent forward, and before I even had a chance to realize what was going on, he lost control of it. The weights came crashing down, and the bar slammed right into his back. He couldn't hold it, and the whole thing tipped forward, falling straight onto me. I didn't have time to dodge it. The next thing I knew, I was lying flat on my back with this 300-pound barbell partially on top of me. My legs were pinned, and my arms were trapped under the bar. My heart started pounding. For a split second, I thought I was seriously hurt. I couldn't even move. It felt like everything was happening in slow motion, and I was panicking, trying to breathe through the pressure. I'm not sure how long I was stuck there, but I remember hearing people around me shouting. Kyle was on the floor, too, trying to push himself up, and there was this horrible mix of panic and embarrassment on his face. He wasn't hurt badly, but he was still shaken, and he was desperately trying to lift the bar off me. It didn't help that I couldn't do much to help him either. My body was just frozen with the weight on me. Some gym staff rushed over and helped us out, lifting the bar off me. They made sure I was okay before anything else. Luckily, I wasn't seriously injured, just a little bruised and sore. My legs were aching and my chest felt tight, but I was fine. The thing is, I wasn't sure if I should be relieved or embarrassed. I could tell that Kyle was mortified, but I didn't feel any better about the situation. How do you even recover from that? The worst part. Kyle was still trying to act like everything was fine. He kept apologizing, but it felt more like he was trying to make it seem like it was just an accident. Like this kind of thing happened all the time. But I could tell he was mostly concerned with saving face, making sure I didn't think less of him for failing at a weight he clearly wasn't ready for. Honestly, it felt like his ego was bruised more than anything else. By this point, I wasn't sure what to do. I was a little shaken up, but mostly embarrassed for both of us. I mean, I just got squashed by a barbell on a first date. Who even does that? It was ridiculous. I wasn't sure if I should just laugh it off or leave, but I knew I couldn't keep going like everything was normal. So I made an excuse to leave. I said I was feeling sore and needed to get home. Kyle tried to convince me to stay, but I could tell he was just uncomfortable too. I wasn't mad at him. Well, not really, but the whole situation had gone from kind of cute to just awkward. I left the gym feeling weird. Part of me was relieved I didn't get seriously hurt, but the other part was just embarrassed about how everything had played out. I thought maybe we'd just laugh about it later, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was just a complete disaster. After that night, I didn't text Kyle again. I just couldn't. I mean, how do you recover from a first date where you nearly get crushed by a 300-pound barbell? I don't even know how to start this. I guess it's one of those stories that feels too crazy to be true, but it is. So, here's how it went down. A couple of weeks ago, my friend set me up with this guy named Darnell. He sounded like a nice enough guy, and my friend assured me he was super chill, laid back, and a total sweetheart. She'd been friends with him for a while, and she swore I'd like him. I was skeptical at first because, honestly, the last thing I wanted was to go on a blind date with someone I barely knew, but I trusted my friend and figured what's the harm. We met through a couple of texts leading up to the date, and honestly, he seemed cool, polite, funny, and easy to talk to. Nothing too weird at all. He even asked if I liked outdoor stuff, which seemed like a solid sign that he was trying to do something thoughtful, not just a typical let's go grab dinner and drinks kind of date. I was kind of down for a change of pace. The day of the date, I'm already running a little late when I finally hop into the Uber Darnell had ordered for me. I try to shake off the nerves. I had no idea what to expect. The driver takes me to this park, one I've never been to before, and I start feeling this strange vibe creeping in. The place was nice enough, but it felt a little too quiet, too perfect. When I get out of the car, Darnell is standing there smiling. He's tall, kind of soft-spoken, but seems genuinely happy to see me. I get out, and he's carrying a big picnic basket and a blanket like something straight out of a cheesy romance movie. I guess that's cute, right? I'm kind of surprised, to be honest, because I wasn't expecting any of this. We walk to this nice little spot near a fountain, surrounded by trees, and he lays everything out. There's a spread of sandwiches, fresh fruit, chips, sparkling water, the whole 9 yards. And honestly, it was kind of sweet. It felt a little extra, but sweet. I could tell he really put some thought into it. I figured I'd just relax, maybe eat, talk a little, and see how the evening goes. It was just a picnic, right? No big deal. But then it all started to take this weird turn. So we're sitting there enjoying the food, talking about random stuff, movies, music, hobbies. You know, the usual date conversation. Things were going fine, not too weird or anything, and I was starting to feel comfortable. Then Darnell does this thing where he suddenly gets quiet, and I think maybe he's just taking in the scenery or something. Next thing I know, he stands up, and I'm like, oh, okay. It's you gotta get something from the basket. But then he gets down on one knee. Yeah, you read that right. He gets down on one knee in the middle of this park with the sun setting behind him. My heart stops for a second, and I don't even know how to react. Then he pulls out this huge box from his pocket, and I swear I thought I was going to pass out. I had no idea what was going on. My brain was completely scrambled. He opens the box, and inside is this huge diamond ring, sparkling in the light. At that moment, I couldn't even breathe. I literally froze. I had no idea what to say. Was this for real? A part of me thought it was a joke. He couldn't be serious, right? We'd only been talking for a little while. I was sitting there just staring at him like I was on some weird prank show. waiting for the punchline to hit. But no, it wasn't a prank. He looked at me, and without missing a beat, he asked me to marry him. I don't remember the exact words he said, but it was something like, "I know we've only known each other for a short time, but I feel like you're the one. Will you marry me?" Like what? I'm not even sure what happened next. My mind was still stuck on the fact that this guy was proposing on our first date. In a park. With a picnic. The ring was probably worth more than my entire apartment. I was completely thrown off. Like, how could someone go from zero to proposing in the span of a couple of hours? For a split second, I actually thought about saying yes. Like, maybe I was just being dramatic. Maybe I was overthinking things, and he was just a really romantic guy who liked to go big. But then the reality hit me. This was too much. I barely knew this guy, and now he was asking me to marry him. I don't care how sweet the picnic was, I couldn't wrap my head around it. So, of course, I had to say no. There was no way I was getting married to a guy I barely knew, not after one date. But in that moment, saying no felt worse than anything. It felt like I was rejecting him, rejecting his whole idea of a perfect fairy tale proposal. I couldn't even look him in the eye for a second. It wasn't like I wanted to be rude, but there was no way I could say yes. I don't think he was expecting me to say yes, either, at least I hope not. But the whole thing just felt so out of nowhere. I didn't even know how to process it. So I just stood up, grabbed my stuff, and walked away. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay in that moment, watching this guy kneeling on the grass with this expensive ring. I felt bad for him, but at the same time, I couldn't stay there and pretend everything was okay. I had to leave. As I walked out of the park, I felt like I was in some weird dream. How did that even happen? How could someone go from being a total stranger to asking for a commitment that big so quickly? I still don't understand it. To be honest, I haven't heard from Darnell since. I didn't block him or anything, but he hasn't reached out either. I'm assuming he figured out that maybe this wasn't the right move either. But yeah, that's my crazy first date horror story. I don't know what was weirder, the fact that he proposed or the fact that I didn't see it coming at all. Either way, it was the strangest thing that's ever happened to me. This one is funny. I met this guy named Jake at a local pub. I wasn't expecting much. I mean, you don't go to a place like that thinking you're going to meet someone who's perfect for you. It's just a spot to grab a drink, hang out, and see where things go, right? But Jake seemed decent. Nice smile, easy to talk to. Nothing about him was off, at least at first. We were sitting at a table by the window, the kind with a view of the street. I remember thinking how ordinary it felt. You know, just a regular first date, a couple of awkward pauses here and there, but that's normal. We had a drink, talked about stupid stuff, work, movies, some dumb stuff about our childhoods, and honestly, it was pretty chill. There wasn't a hint of anything strange, no red flags or anything that made me question the whole "is this person crazy" vibe. I could have seen myself hanging out with him more, maybe. Then he suddenly got up to use the bathroom. That's when things started to get weird. I didn't think much of it at first, but then something caught my eye. He left his wallet on the table. Now, I'm not the type to go snooping, but I don't know, something about it felt off. I mean, who leaves their wallet behind, especially when they're going to be gone for who knows how long? Maybe 5 minutes, maybe more. It just wasn't adding up. So, yeah, I'll admit it. Curiosity got the best of me. I wasn't planning to do anything shady, but I figured I'd just peek inside to see what kind of guy leaves his wallet behind. Maybe he had a picture in there or like a weird ID. Who knows? But when I pulled it open, my stomach kind of dropped. The first thing I noticed was the ID. It wasn't his name. Like, not even close. The picture looked like him, but the name, it wasn't the name he told me. It wasn't even a common name. I felt a little weird, but I figured maybe it was some old ID or something. People hang on to stuff, right? It didn't have to mean anything. But then I flipped it over, and that's when I saw something that made me stop cold. There was a note in the wallet. It wasn't a big deal, just a small piece of paper folded up. But the handwriting, it wasn't something that felt normal. It looked rushed, almost frantic, like someone had written it in a hurry. And the words, they were unsettling. It said, "Make sure they don't see you. You're not safe. Don't let them get away with it." My heart started pounding in my chest. I felt like I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. Like maybe I was in the middle of some messed up situation, and I didn't even realize it yet. I put the wallet down real quick and tried to act natural. I didn't want to make a scene. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore it. Something didn't add up, and I felt like I had to know more. Then Jake came back. His face went white the second he saw me holding his wallet. He froze, the kind of freeze where you know something's wrong, but you don't know how to react. He looked like he had just been caught doing something. But what? I tried to act casual, but my stomach was doing flips. He didn't even sit back down at first. He just stared at me, and I could tell he was working hard to keep his cool. But there was something in his eyes, something I hadn't noticed before. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and uncomfortable. He sat back down slowly, almost like he was testing the waters, seeing if I was going to say something. The rest of the night felt like a blur. We made some awkward small talk, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd just seen. His wallet, the note, the name that wasn't his. It was like I'd stumbled into some messed up puzzle I wasn't ready to solve, and I had no idea how deep it went. I tried to ignore it, but the weirdness lingered. He was trying too hard to keep the conversation light, but there was this heaviness hanging between us. Every time he looked at me, it felt like he was expecting me to say something, but I had no idea what to say. Should I confront him? What if he was some kind of scam artist? What if that wasn't even his real ID, and I was dealing with a complete stranger? I told myself to just finish the date, get through it, and leave. Maybe I was overthinking things. But the feeling didn't go away. I couldn't shake it. As the night wore on, he seemed more and more tense, like he was waiting for something to happen. Or maybe he was waiting for me to figure something out. Eventually, I decided I was done. I paid my part of the tab and told him I had to go. It was a lame excuse, but I didn't want to stick around. He didn't argue, just nodded like he expected it. I remember walking out of that pub feeling a little shaken, like I had just missed something important but couldn't put my finger on it. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I thought about that wallet, the strange name, the note. What was Jake hiding? What did he mean by don't let him get away with it? It felt like a puzzle with pieces I couldn't fit together. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept wondering if I should have done something different. Asked more questions, maybe even taken the note with me. But at the same time, I didn't want to get involved in something that wasn't my problem. The next day, I tried to put it out of my mind, but I couldn't. There was something off about Jake. I knew deep down I'd never get a straight answer. Maybe he wasn't even his real self. Maybe I dodged a bullet by walking away. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But one thing was for sure, I'd never be going back to that pub. And if I ever saw Jake again, I'd probably run in the opposite direction. I met Liam at this dive bar I usually go to on weekends. You know, nothing fancy. Just a place to grab a drink and hang out. It was actually kind of quiet that night, just the right vibe for a first date. He looked pretty normal at first, tall, dark hair, dressed casually. We started chatting, and immediately something felt off. Like I knew him, I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but I was sure we'd met before. We were talking about the usual stuff, work, hobbies, random small talk, but there was this weird familiarity between us. He even laughed at the same jokes I'd told someone else once, which totally freaked me out. I didn't bring it up, though. He seemed cool enough. Maybe I was just imagining it. But the more we talked, the more I felt it. It wasn't just the way he looked or how he talked. It was like we'd already been through this whole conversation before. I started to get that uncomfortable feeling, when you're like, wait, did I already do this? But Liam acted totally normal, like it was our first time meeting. He had no idea what I was talking about when I tried to mention it, so I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. I convinced myself it was just nerves. The night went on and we had a couple of drinks. Honestly, it wasn't a bad time, just a little weird. He was charming, but there was this underlying feeling I couldn't shake. It was like deja vu, but more intense, like I was slipping into some alternate reality where everything seemed so familiar, but also wrong at the same time. I kept telling myself to relax. Maybe he was just someone I'd seen at the bar before. I mean, it's a small town, right? People cross paths all the time. But no, this felt different. There was something about his eyes, the way he looked at me, that made it seem like we had a history. Like there was a secret we both knew but couldn't talk about. The date ended, and I gave him my number, still feeling this weird vibe. I didn't really want to think about it too much, but something was bothering me. He walked me to my car, said he'd text me later, and that was that. I didn't think much of it as I drove home. Once I got inside and checked my phone, that's when things got weird. Really weird. I had a text from him already, but it wasn't a simple, had a good time tonight. It was a text from a few weeks ago. I didn't even recognize the number at first, but the message itself caught me off guard. He texted me before. He had texted me months ago. And I had replied. I started scrolling through our messages, and I swear to God, I couldn't remember any of it. There were pictures, messages, plans we had made, all of it. And I had no memory of any of it. I mean, I would have remembered, right? How could I forget meeting someone, hanging out with them, making plans? But there it was in black and white. We had been talking. We had met before, and I didn't remember a thing. I started freaking out. I tried to think back. Had I blacked out or something? Did I have a concussion? What the hell was going on? I thought maybe I was just overthinking it. But then I scrolled even further back in the conversation, and that's when I found it. The text that sent my heart into overdrive. He had sent a message that said, "You don't remember our last date. I thought you'd be the one who'd forget." I froze. I felt a cold rush go through me and my mind started to race. The words were like a punch in the gut. I had no memory of this date he was talking about, but apparently it was a big deal. How can I forget something like that? And if I really met him before, why didn't I remember it? Why did everything feel so off when we met tonight? I texted him back asking what he meant. He didn't reply for a while, but when he did, his message was short. Too short. He said, "Guess it doesn't matter now, huh?" I stared at my screen, trying to make sense of it all. It didn't make sense. There was no way I had forgotten something so important, right? That's when it hit me. I hadn't just forgotten one date. I'd forgotten all of it. Everything. I couldn't remember anything from those texts, those plans. It was like someone had wiped it all out of my brain. I tried to retrace my steps to think back, but there was nothing. It was as if I was living in some weird parallel reality where the past didn't exist for me. I started feeling paranoid. Was this some kind of weird prank? Had someone messed with my head? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how deep this went. If Liam knew all this stuff about me, if he had texted me before and I had no memory of it, then what else didn't I remember? What else had happened that I was completely unaware of? I didn't sleep much that night. I kept going over the messages, reading his words over and over, trying to make sense of it all. The next day, I decided to message him again. Maybe I'd get some answers this time. I asked him straight up, "What do you mean by our last date?" I don't remember it. He replied instantly, "You don't remember, do you? Guess it's for the best." And then he blocked me. At that point, I didn't know what to think anymore. I tried calling him, but his number was disconnected. His social media accounts were all gone too. It was like he had vanished off the face of the earth. I kept looking back at the messages we'd exchanged, searching for any hint of what had happened, but it was all gone. No answers, just more questions. The weirdest part, I never went on a date with him before that night. As far as I could tell, we had never met before. But something in my gut told me that wasn't true. I don't know if it was a glitch, I was going crazy, or if something else entirely was going on, but I never heard from him again. And I don't think I ever want to. I was really excited about meeting Natalie. We'd been talking online for a few weeks, and everything seemed pretty normal. You know, the usual back and forth of getting to know someone, trading jokes, and sharing stuff about life. She was cool, funny, and seemed like a pretty chill person. So when we finally decided to meet up in person, I figured it was going to be a smooth, easygoing date. We chose a small cafe downtown, the kind that had cozy little booths and soft lighting. Perfect for a first meetup. I got there a little early, which I usually do, so I grabbed a seat and started scrolling through my phone while I waited for her. I wasn't really nervous, but I guess there's always that little voice in your head, right? What it's awkward. But the second Natalie walked in, I recognized her immediately. She looked just like her pictures, and when she smiled at me, I knew it was going to be fine. We sat down, started chatting, and at first, everything felt totally normal. We talked about the usual stuff: hobbies, jobs, favorite places to hang out. It was going well. The conversation flowed easily, and she seemed just like her online self, friendly, open, and relaxed. I remember thinking, this is going great. Then, out of nowhere, her phone rang. It wasn't a loud ring, but it was enough to break the flow of the conversation. Nayli looked down at her phone and quickly glanced at the screen before answering it. She excused herself with a little smile, and I just sat there, watching her talk. The way she spoke was strange. She wasn't talking loudly or saying much. Her responses were short, like she was holding something back. I could barely hear the other side of the conversation, But the voice on the other end, it sounded exactly like her. It was like hearing her own voice, but in a weird, slightly off way. I didn't want to be rude or eavesdrop, but it was hard not to notice the change in her tone. She seemed tense, her eyes darting around a little like she was trying to keep her cool. She wasn't laughing or being her usual self like she had been earlier. It just felt wrong, like she was having a conversation, but at the same time she wasn't really there. After what felt like a minute, maybe two, she ended the call, placing her phone back on the table. She gave me a small, awkward smile and said something about how she was sorry to interrupt. I nodded, not wanting to make things weird, but something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first, but my gut was starting to tell me that something wasn't right. So I asked her who it was. It wasn't an intrusive question. I was just curious. She didn't answer right away, though. There was a pause, and then she looked at me with this confused expression, like I just asked her a really strange question. It wasn't a big deal, but her reaction made me feel even more uneasy. She looked at me for a second, blinked a few times, and then said, "What do you mean?" No one called me. Her voice was almost too calm, too casual, like it was an obvious thing. I just stared at her for a second. No one had called her, but I heard it. I heard her voice on the other end of the line. It was a moment of complete confusion. Was I imagining things? Maybe I had misheard it or misunderstood it somehow, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. I didn't want to press her about it. I didn't want to seem weird, especially on a first date. So I just let it slide, figuring I just misheard it. But the whole vibe between us shifted after that. I started getting this odd feeling like she wasn't being honest, or maybe she was hiding something. It wasn't like she was being outright shady, but there was this undercurrent of weirdness that I couldn't ignore. We kept talking, but I couldn't stop thinking about the phone call. The voice on the other end. The way she reacted to me asking who it was. She was being weird and I wasn't sure how to feel about it. Was she lying to me? Did she have some reason for not telling me who it was? Or was I just overthinking it? I honestly didn't know what to think anymore. As the date went on, I tried to push the thought out of my mind. We talked about other things, her favorite books, movies, places to travel. She even laughed a few times, which made me feel a little better, like maybe I was just being paranoid. But deep down, that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Something about that call, about her reaction, didn't sit right with me. Eventually, the day came to a close and we said our goodbyes. I was polite, even though I was still trying to piece together what had just happened. I told her I had a good time, and she smiled and said we should do it again sometime. I agreed, but in the back of my mind, I knew something was off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the phone call, about the voice that sounded so much like her. I kept replaying it in my head, but nothing made sense. It was like I was stuck in this loop, trying to figure out what had really happened. I started wondering if I had imagined it all, or if maybe I was just overthinking. I didn't want to be that person who makes a big deal out of nothing, but I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had felt. The next day I thought about texting her, maybe asking her about it again. But something stopped me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I just felt like if I brought it up again, it would make things worse. So I left it. I didn't reach out. A few weeks later, I bumped into Natalie at the same cafe. It was totally random, but we smiled and said hello. She didn't seem to recognize me right away, which threw me off. After all, we just had that date not long ago. But she was polite and friendly, and we had a short conversation about the usual small stuff. Nothing too personal. I couldn't help but wonder if she remembered the phone call, or if maybe she was just pretending it never happened. And then I realized I was fine with not knowing, because whatever it wasn't something I wanted to get involved with. Something told me it was better to leave in the past. So I walked away and I never saw her again after that. But every now and then when I hear a phone ring or see a familiar face, I still get that weird feeling. That feeling like I'm missing something important, something that I'm better off not knowing. I met Daniel on one of those online dating apps. You know, the ones where everyone tries to sound super casual, but really, you're all just looking for something to click. He seemed nice at first. In his pictures, he looked friendly and put together, and his profile was pretty normal. His messages were charming, and after a few days of chatting, we decided to meet up at this cute little cafe. Honestly, I was kind of excited. It had been a while since I'd gone on a date, and he seemed cool enough. When I walked in, I spotted him right away. He was sitting at a table near the window, smiling up at me as I approached. He looked exactly like his photos. Tall, dark hair, well dressed. I felt a little nervous, but not in a bad way. More like I was hoping this would go well. He stood up to greet me, and we exchanged pleasantries before sitting down to get started. At first, everything was fine. We talked about the usual first date stuff, where we're from, what we do for work, our hobbies. I was starting to feel pretty comfortable around him. He was easy to talk to, well-spoken, and kept the conversation flowing. Honestly, I was thinking this could go somewhere. He seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say, and I thought it was nice to meet someone who could actually hold a conversation without making it feel awkward. But then things started to get weird. It wasn't immediate, but about halfway through the date, the questions he asked started to feel a little off. They weren't bad questions, but they were way too personal for someone I just met. I figured it was just him trying to get to know me better, but the more he asked, the stranger it felt. He asked about my family, like who they were, what they did for a living, if I had any siblings. That seemed pretty normal at first, but then he got more specific. He asked about how close I was to them, whether they'd be able to support me if something happened. It was strange, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe he was just making conversation. Maybe he was trying to connect in his own way. Then he asked about my financial situation. At first, I thought maybe he was talking about work, but it quickly became clear he was talking about money in a much broader sense. "Do you have savings?" he asked, his voice calm, almost too calm. "Do you have any investments or insurance? What would happen to all of your stuff if something happened to you?" I didn't really know how to respond. I felt like I was being put on the spot, but I didn't want to be rude. So I gave him a vague answer, something along the lines of, I have some savings, but nothing crazy. I tried to steer the conversation in a different direction, thinking maybe he was just trying to make small talk, but he didn't take the hint. He smiled, but it didn't feel like a normal smile. It was more like he was humoring me, and was almost rehearsed. He leaned in a little like he was telling me a secret. "So," he said, "if something happened to you, who would inherit everything?" I froze. What kind of question was that? Who even asked that on a first date? It wasn't like we were discussing life plans or anything. It felt like he was asking me for something more than I was willing to give. I tried to brush it off, to laugh it off, but his gaze was steady, almost unblinking. It was like he was waiting for me to answer. I felt my stomach twist. My mind was racing, but I didn't want to seem like I was overreacting. Maybe he was just trying to be playful. Maybe it was one of those weird questions people ask to see how you'll react. I didn't know, but something inside me told me that this wasn't normal. I gave him a vague response, something like, well, I guess it would go to my family. I didn't want to give him any more information than that. It was none of his business. But he didn't stop. Instead, he smiled again, that same strange smile, and said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it. I'll be seeing you soon." What? I didn't know how to respond. It wasn't even what he said that got to me. It was the way he said it. There was no emotion behind it. It was just calm, almost mechanical. Like he already knew the answer to this question, like everything was already decided. It felt like a warning, but I couldn't figure out what it meant. I didn't want to seem weirded out, so I just nodded and smiled, trying to keep the conversation going. But my gut was screaming at me that something was wrong. After that, the rest of the date felt like a blur. I couldn't focus on what he was saying. All I could think about was that weird comment he made. I didn't want to go into full-blown panic mode, but I knew I couldn't ignore how I was feeling. There was something about him that just didn't sit right. He had been charming at first, but now everything about him seemed like an act. I kept thinking back to his calm, rehearsed way of speaking, like he had asked that question 1,000 times before, and knew exactly what kind of response he wanted from me. When the date finally ended, he walked me to my car. I tried to be polite, but I could barely make eye contact with him. I didn't want to seem rude, but all I wanted to do was get in my car and leave. He smiled that same smile again before he said, "I'll be seeing you soon." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and drove off. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just been part of something weird and unsettling. I didn't know if I was just overreacting or if something was actually wrong with him. But everything he said, especially that last comment, kept playing in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't text him after that. I couldn't. The whole thing felt off, and I didn't want to invite whatever it was he had planned in my life. He hadn't seemed dangerous at first, but now I wasn't so sure. Maybe it was all weird misunderstanding, or maybe he was just trying to mess with me. Either way, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to see him again. So I never did. I didn't reach out, and I never heard from him again. but every now and then I wonder if I made the right decision. I still think about that question he asked, and how he didn't just ask it. He insisted on knowing the answer. Maybe I'll never know what he meant by that. Maybe it's better that way. I thought it was going to be one of those easy, casual dates. You know the kind. The ones where you grab coffee or maybe dinner with someone you met online, and you just chat about life, see if there's any connection, and decide if it's worth trying again. Nothing serious. I've been texting Rachel for a little while, and from what I could tell, she seemed like a cool girl. Her profile was all smiles and adventures, talking about her love for hiking and good books. All the usual stuff. She even seemed a little quirky, which I thought was pretty refreshing. So we meet up at this little cafe in the city. It was cozy with string lights hanging from the ceiling and a warm, relaxed vibe. Honestly, the whole thing felt pretty laid back, just like you'd want a first date to be. Rachel was nice, friendly, and cute in a way that made it easy to talk to her. We talked about the basics, work, hobbies, our favorite movies, and everything seemed normal. No red flags, no weird vibes, yet. And then halfway through the date, things started to take a strange turn. It was one of those moments where you feel like something is off, but you can't quite pinpoint it. We were talking about relationships, and Rachel asked me a question that seemed a little out of left field. She asked me if I'd ever been involved in something you can't get out of. At first, I thought she was asking about something like a bad habit or maybe a past relationship that I couldn't shake, but the way she asked it so seriously made me pause. I didn't really understand what she meant, so I kind of laughed it off. I figured it was one of those weird questions people ask when they want to sound mysterious or philosophical. But she didn't drop it. She asked again, more insistent this time. No, seriously. Have you ever been stuck in something you can't get out of? Her tone was still calm, but there was something in her eyes, almost like she was waiting for me to answer a question I didn't fully understand yet. I remember feeling a little uncomfortable. I didn't know if she was trying to probe into my past or if she was just being weird on purpose, but something felt off. I didn't want to sound like a freak, so I just said something vague like, I've been in situations where I felt stuck, sure, but nothing like that. She nodded slowly, but I could tell she wasn't satisfied with that answer. Then, without warning, she slid an envelope across the table to me. It had my name on it. I stared at it for a moment, trying to process what was happening. It was sealed, and the handwriting on the front didn't look like hers. I looked up at her, trying to figure out what was going on, but she didn't look nervous or concerned. She just watched me, her expression unreadable. Now, at this point, I'll admit I was a little freaked out. I didn't know if this was some weird joke or if she was seriously messing with me, but I didn't want to be rude. So I opened the envelope, hoping it was just a letter with some random funny note. I wasn't prepared for what I found inside. The letter was strange. It was written in a way that felt off. The handwriting wasn't messy or hurried, but it wasn't neat either. It had a kind of eerie, cryptic quality to it. I started reading it, and my stomach dropped as I realized what it was. It was about me. It described things from my past, details about my life, my family, things that only my ex knew. It wasn't some generic message. It was specific. It talked about my job, my favorite childhood memories, my ex and I's breakup. There were things in that letter that no one, except maybe a few close friends, should have known about me. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the warning. The letter said I needed to stop dating Rachel, that she had a habit of getting too attached, and that if I didn't, things might get bad. The whole thing felt like a threat. There was no mistaking it. The letter was warning me to stay away from her. I remember my hands shaking as I read it. I couldn't even make sense of it. Why was someone writing this about Rachel? What did it mean? And why the hell was she handing it to me on our first date? I looked up at her, my head spinning, and that's when I saw it. Her smile was gone. Her face was blank, but there was something behind her eyes now. Something that wasn't there before. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like I was seeing her for the first time, like the mask had slipped, and I wasn't sure who I was looking at anymore. I froze, not knowing what to do. I couldn't even look at the letter anymore. I wanted to shove it back in the envelope, but it felt like I couldn't move. Everything about the situation felt surreal. Was this some kind of sick joke? But the more I stared at her, the more it hit me. The letter wasn't from someone else. It was from her. She had written it herself. The way she looked at me, the way she wasn't blinking, the way she was so calm. It all made sense now. She had somehow known things about me, things no one else should know, and she had written a letter pretending to be someone else. and then she handed it to me. She wanted me to read it. She wanted to see my reaction. And that's when I realized how dangerous this situation was. I didn't know what was going on, but I could feel my heart start to race. I needed to get out of there. I pushed the letter back across the table, my fingers brushing against the edges of the paper as I did. I couldn't stop looking at her. She was still smiling, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was like she was waiting for me to figure it all out, to understand the game she was playing. I tried to stand up, but my legs felt like jelly. I don't know how I made it out of the cafe, but somehow I managed to pay for my drink and leave. I don't think I said anything to her. I just walked out, my mind racing. I didn't know what just happened, but I knew I needed to get as far away from her as possible. I hadn't heard from her since that night, and to be honest, I hope I never do. But every time I think about that date, that damn envelope, I wonder how much of my life she really knows, and why she wanted to play that twisted game with me in the first place. I was pretty excited about the date. I mean, it had been a while since I'd actually gone out with someone, and Maya seemed great from the chats we had online. She had this vibe, the kind that made you feel like you could talk to her about anything, but not in an overwhelming way. It felt easy. We met up at this cozy little restaurant I liked, a place that had great food and a laid-back atmosphere. It was perfect for a first date, nothing too fancy or intimidating. At first, everything was normal. Maya was even more charming in person, smiling, laughing at my dumb jokes, and keeping the conversation flowing. We talked about the usual stuff, work, where we grew up, what we like to do in our spare time. It was nothing out of the ordinary, but it felt like it was going well. She was easy to be around, and I figured it'd be one of those dates where we'd end up texting each other afterward, making plans for the next hangout. But about halfway through the evening, everything shifted. Her phone rang, and she gave me an apologetic smile as she looked at the screen. She answered it quickly and excused herself, stepping outside to take the call. I didn't think much of it at first. People get calls, right? It was no big deal. I kept eating my food, checked my phone for a few messages, and tried to make myself feel like I wasn't awkwardly sitting there alone. But then something started to feel off. Maya was gone for a lot longer than I expected, and when she came back in, her face looked different. She was pale, like she had seen something that unsettled her, but she was trying to cover it up. She sat back down across from me, and I could see her hands trembling just a little as she fiddled with her glass. I asked her if everything was okay, but she didn't really give me an answer. She just looked at me like she was processing something, as if she was debating what to say or whether she should even say anything at all. Then, out of nowhere, she stood up and said she had to go. It wasn't like she'd gotten up to use the restroom or anything. She just stood up abruptly, like she had made up her mind and there was no discussion about it. I wasn't sure what to say, but I tried to ask her what happened, if everything was all right. I thought maybe something was wrong with her family or she had gotten some bad news, but she didn't answer me. She didn't even look back as she walked down the restaurant. I sat there not sure if I should be concerned or if this was just some weird thing she needed to handle. At this point, I was confused and a little thrown off, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. I figured I'd give her some space, and if it was important, she'd reach out. But as I sat there, I started to hear her voice again. It was faint at first, but it was coming from outside, and the tone in her voice wasn't what I expected. She was speaking quickly, and she sounded frantic. I couldn't make out everything she was saying, but it was clear that something had her on edge. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that maybe it was just a stressful situation she was dealing with, but then I realized something weird. There was no one outside with her. I didn't see anyone talking to her, and I didn't hear the sound of footsteps or any background noise like you'd expect from someone else being around. It was just her voice. It was like she was speaking to thin air. I tried to get up to see if I could spot her, but she was already walking away. The phone call was still going on, but the voice on the other end was too muffled for me to understand. I don't even know why I was still sitting there, staring out the window, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was like she was talking to someone who wasn't even there, and I couldn't explain why that unsettled me so much. I watched her walk down the street, still talking, still sounding agitated. I could barely make out the words, but the more I listened, the more it felt like there was a sense of urgency to the conversation. It was like she was pleading with someone or maybe begging them to help, but I still couldn't understand who she was talking to. It didn't make sense. I kept telling myself it was just some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe she was dealing with something serious, and she didn't want to explain it to me right then. I could respect that right. But then I caught something that made my blood run cold. As I sat there listening, I realized the phone call was still going, even though she was getting farther away. I couldn't hear her voice as clearly, but it was like the conversation was still happening. And it wasn't just the sound of her speaking. I could still hear the voice on the other end, faint but persistent, as if it was following her. It was like it wasn't coming from the phone at all. I felt a weird knot in my stomach, but I couldn't bring myself to leave just yet. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was just overthinking it. I decided to wait a few minutes, hoping Maya would come back and explain herself, but she never did. The sound of her talking kept fading into the distance, and after a while, it just stopped altogether. I didn't hear from her again that night, and honestly, I never heard from her after that. I tried texting her a few times, but there was no response. I even reached out on social media, but she never answered. It's been a couple of weeks now, and I still can't get over what happened. The more I think about it, the more I'm convinced that there was something off about the entire situation. I don't know if she was talking to someone who wasn't there or if it was all in my head. But the fact that I never heard from her again, that she left without a word and didn't even give me a chance to ask what was going on, just doesn't sit right with me. Sometimes I still hear that voice in my head, wondering what it was that Maya was really involved in and what I almost got caught up in. I had been talking to Tom for a while online before we decided to meet in person. We hit it off pretty well, or at least I thought we did. He seemed normal enough. His messages were polite, he had a good sense of humor, and there were no major red flags. So when he suggested grabbing drinks at a local bar, I was all for it. I thought it'd be just like any other casual date, a chance to talk and get to know each other better, maybe see if there was any real chemistry. We met at a small bar downtown, one of those low-key places that aren't too crowded, but still have a good vibe. It was perfect for a first date. Tom looked exactly like his pictures. Tall, dark hair, kind of that I'm definitely not trying too hard look. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, had some small talk, and before long we were both comfortably sipping on our drinks. At first, everything was fine. We chatted about movies, music, random stuff like how much we hated waiting in line at the grocery store. But then, out of nowhere, Tom started asking these strange questions. They weren't totally off the wall at first, but the way he phrased them started to make me uncomfortable. He asked me about my views on certain topics: politics, race, religion. I figured, okay, we're adults. It's normal to talk about these things when you're getting to know someone. I didn't mind talking about them. I mean, we all have opinions, right? But as the conversation went on, I started noticing a weird shift in his tone. His questions started to feel less like casual conversation and more like an interrogation, like he was testing me somehow. At one point, he asked me what I thought about people who didn't contribute to society. It wasn't even the question itself that was so disturbing. It was the way he asked it. It was like he was trying to make me say something specific, like he already had a set answer in mind, and he was waiting for me to fall in line with it. I thought I misheard him, but when I asked him to clarify, he just repeated it. I told him that I believed everyone had value, no matter what they did or didn't contribute to society. That everyone deserved a chance to live their life in a way that felt right to them. It wasn't the most profound answer, but it was the truth, and I wasn't about to start playing some weird game with him. But that answer didn't seem to sit right with him. He paused for a second, looked at me almost like he was evaluating me, and then he leaned in closer. I wasn't sure if he was trying to be dramatic or if something was actually wrong with him, but then he asked something that really threw me off. He asked me, if the world were better off without a few people, would you agree? I thought he was joking, trying to be edgy or provocative, so I laughed it off at first. I mean, who asked a question like that on a first date? But his expression didn't change. He didn't smile. It was like he was dead serious. I felt my stomach turn a little as he leaned forward even more, lowering his voice as if he was telling me something important, like he was sharing a deep secret. I'm not kidding, he said, and I could feel my pulse quicken. I think we'd be better off with fewer people, especially people who don't deserve to be here. At that point, I wasn't sure how to react. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Was he just trying to shock me? Was this some kind of test to see how far he could push me? But no, this wasn't just some weird pickup line or a lame attempt at being deep. There was something in his eyes, this cold, intense look that made me feel like I was talking to someone who wasn't all there. I wasn't sure if he was joking or if he truly believed what he was saying, but either way I knew I had to get out of there. I tried to play off as best as I could, changing the subject and asking about his job or something less sinister. But it didn't work. Tom wasn't done with the conversation. He kept asking more of these weird questions, all revolving around what I thought about undeserving people, people who take up space, people who just didn't fit in. It was like he was trying to gauge where I stood on some sort of moral scale, but it felt so off, so uncomfortable that I was starting to get nervous. I could feel my anxiety rising. My gut told me that I needed to leave, but I didn't want to seem rude. I didn't want to just get up and walk away, especially not after we'd been talking for so long. But I knew there was something wrong with this guy. He was crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed, even if it was just a conversation. It felt like he was trying to manipulate me into agreeing with him, or worse. He was trying to gauge how far he could go with his disturbing beliefs before I would get scared. After another few minutes of awkward, tense silence, I finally decided I had enough. I told him I needed to use the restroom and excused myself. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I walked to the back of the bar. I wasn't sure if I should call a cab or just bolt out of there, but my mind was racing with how I could get out without making a scene. I was already halfway to the restroom when I heard his voice calling after me. I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. I just kept walking. When I got to the bathroom, I pulled my phone out, texting my friend like a million times to let her know what was going on. I didn't feel safe anymore. I didn't trust him, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much of a mistake it was to have even agreed to meet up with him in the first place. I stayed in the bathroom for a good 15 minutes, just trying to calm down. When I finally mustered up the courage to leave, I took the back exit of the bar and called a cab from a block away. I didn't want to run into him again. I didn't get any messages or calls from Tom after that night, and honestly, I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear from him. I blocked him on everything and I never looked back. The whole night still haunts me. I don't know if he was just a guy trying to be provocative or if he really believed the things he said, but whatever it was, I'm just glad I got out of there when I did. It's been a while since that date, but I still can't shake the feeling that something was off about him, something I can't quite explain. I don't think I'll ever know for sure, but I'd rather not find out either. Here's a crazy story that still messes with my head. It all started with a date. I met Patty through a dating app, and after a few weeks of texting back and forth, we decided to grab dinner. She was cute, funny, and seemed genuinely interested in me. It was one of those things where everything felt right, like the kind of first date that goes exactly as you imagine it should. We picked a nice little bistro downtown, not too fancy, but just the right vibe. The place was quiet, the lighting was perfect, and the conversation flowed pretty easily. I was feeling good about things, The whole this might actually work out kind of feeling. She was easy to talk to, had a good sense of humor, and seemed like a genuinely kind person. We talked about everything: work, travel, music, the usual stuff you chat about when you're trying to break the ice. But as the night went on, things started to get a little off. The conversation started drifting in weird directions, especially when she started talking about her family. Now, I don't know about you, but I find it normal to ask someone about their family, especially on a date. So when she casually brought them up, I figured it'd be a simple, normal topic to go with. But no, Patty went into some really weird details. She started by saying that her parents were different, and it kind of caught me off guard. At first, I thought she just meant they were quirky or had some unusual habits, like maybe they were the type to collect weird things or talk about UFOs. But when I asked her what she meant by different, she just smiled and immediately changed the subject. It was like she didn't want to get into it, but the way she said it left me feeling uneasy. It was like she was hiding something, but I didn't press it. After all, first date, right? You don't want to push too much, especially when someone seems to be dodging a topic. We finished up dinner and went for a walk through a nearby park. It was a little colder than I expected, but still nice enough to stroll around for a bit. We talked more, and I could tell she was getting more comfortable, but every now and then she mentioned something else about her family in the same cryptic way. She said her parents didn't belong to this place, and when I asked if she meant they were from another country or something, she again dodged the question. I could tell it was bothering her to talk about it, so I didn't push it too much. I mean, I didn't want to make her uncomfortable, especially when things were going well overall. We said our goodbyes at the end of the night, and I texted her when I got home to let her know I had a good time and that I'd like to see her again. Then came the weird part. A few hours later, I had a text from her. It was a picture, a family portrait. At first, I didn't think anything of it, just another one of those, here's a photo of me and my fam kind of deals. But when I looked closer at the picture, I started feeling off. At first glance, everything seemed fine, though she was smiling with two people who I assumed were her parents. They looked like an ordinary family in an ordinary photo. But the more I stared at it, the more I started noticing small things that didn't sit right. Her parents, in particular, looked old. Way older than they should have been. I mean, in the picture, they looked ancient, like they belonged in some old-timey photograph, but they were wearing modern clothes. The way they smiled in the picture was unsettling, too. It wasn't like a normal, warm family smile. It was cold. And their eyes. There was something about their eyes. They looked almost lifeless, like they weren't really seeing anything in front of them. It was hard to explain, but it gave you the creeps. So, naturally, I texted her and asked, who are these people? They don't look like, well, they don't look like they should be your parents. I don't know what I was expecting, but I didn't get what I thought I would. She responded with one of those cryptic answers that I couldn't even begin to understand. She said, they aren't the people you think they are. Now, I don't know about you, but at this point, I'm starting to get seriously freaked out. Like, I was honestly starting to think I had been set up for some kind of weird prank. Maybe I was on some hidden camera show, and the whole thing was a setup. It felt like a bad horror movie where you start to wonder if you've stepped into a world you don't belong in. I stared at her message for what felt like forever. I didn't know how to respond, and to be honest, I didn't know what to think. Was she joking? Was she messing with me? Or was there something actually wrong here? I could feel my heart racing, and I was just confused. So I decided to text her one more time. I asked her, what do you mean by that? Are they not really your parents? What's going on? I never got a response. I waited for hours, checking my phone, hoping she'd just text me back and explain. Maybe she was just weird, maybe she had a quirky sense of humor, or maybe I was overthinking everything. But after several hours with no reply, I started to feel like I had to do something. I knew something wasn't right and my gut was telling me to back off. So I did. I blocked her number and deleted the photo. Honestly, I didn't want to see her again, and I didn't want to risk finding out what was really going on with her family. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't even know her last name, and the weirdness of the entire night started to feel like a warning. A few days later, I saw her on the dating app again, but something was different. Her profile had changed, like completely wiped. It was like she had erased everything. All her pictures were gone, and all that was left was a blank profile with no bio or anything. It was like she never existed. I haven't heard from her since, and I honestly don't want to. I'm still not sure what was going on with that whole night, but I know one thing for sure. I won't be meeting anyone like her again. Some things are better left unknown. I'll start this off by saying I honestly didn't know what I was getting into when I agreed to meet Claire. We had been talking online for a little while, and she seemed chill. We had a lot in common, both into sports, both hated drama, and both loved food. So when she suggested going to this fancy Italian restaurant for dinner, I thought it was a good idea. I mean, it's always nice to try new places, right? The day of the date, Claire texts me and tells me she's ready and we should meet up outside the restaurant. I had done a little research and I knew the place was pretty upscale, so I decided to wear a nice button-down shirt and jeans. Nothing too over the top, but enough to look decent. I get to the restaurant first and I'm waiting outside. It's a bit chilly, but I didn't mind. I was excited to meet Claire in person. So I'm standing there looking around when I see her walking up. And well, let's just say she wasn't exactly dressed for the occasion. She was wearing a bright red tracksuit. You know, the kind with the big logo on the chest, the kind of outfit you wear when you're about to head to the gym or just chill at home. I had no idea what was going on, but I tried not to judge. After all, she could just be one of those people who doesn't care about fancy places and likes to do things her own way. But still, I knew this place had a pretty strict dress code. It's the kind of place where they have those doormen who check you out from head to toe and give you a once-over before letting you in. We get to the door, and the doorman immediately looks her up and down. You could tell he wasn't thrilled. He was polite at first, but it was obvious she wasn't going to get in wearing that. I was trying to figure out what to do, but before I could say anything, Claire just pushes past me and goes straight for the door. The doorman steps in front of her, holding his hand out to stop her. He tells her, with a tone that's firm but respectful, that there's a dress code, and she can't come in wearing a tracksuit. Honestly, I thought it was a bit much, but I wasn't enough to start a scene. I just kind of stood there, watching the exchange, feeling super awkward. And that's when things started to go sideways. Claire doesn't say anything at first. She just stands there, staring at the doorman like she's processing what he just said. And then, out of nowhere, she shoves him. Hard. It happened so fast I didn't even know what to think. The doorman stumbles back a bit, more surprised than hurt, and before he can get his balance, Claire's yelling something about how she's not some rich snob who needs to follow rules, or something along those lines. At this point, I'm totally speechless. I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there frozen, watching the scene unfold. The doorman, clearly flustered, presses a button on his earpiece and starts talking into it. A few seconds later, another security guard shows up. He's bigger and more muscular, and he's not here to play around. But Claire, she's not backing down. In fact, she is more aggressive. She starts swearing at them, telling them how stupid their dress code is. And then, this is the part I'll never forget, she lunges at the bigger guard. It wasn't just a shove this time. She actually took a swing at him. I'm standing there like, what the heck is going on? As this all plays out in front of me. The security guard grabs her arms, trying to subdue her, but she's not having it. She's kicking and trying to push him away, still screaming at him and the doorman. The whole scene is chaotic, and people around us are starting to notice. Some are even pulling out their phones to film it. I'm just standing there, watching this whole thing go down, and I feel like I've stepped into some weird nightmare. After a few more seconds of struggling, Claire manages to break free. She runs for the door, but before she can get 2 steps in, the second security guard grabs her again. This time, it's serious. She's pinned to the ground by both of them, and now it's clear. We're not going to dinner. We're about to get kicked out, and probably get arrested too. I'm still frozen, unsure of what to do. I never thought the night would go like this. A few minutes later, a cop car rolls up. At this point, I'm just shaking my head. This was not how I imagined my first date going at all. Claire is still yelling, and I can see the cops are starting to get annoyed with her. They're trying to calm her down, but she's just too far gone. They cuff her, and that's when it hit me. This wasn't some mistake or overreaction. She was legitimately out of control. I don't know if she was just having a bad day or if this was how she always acted, but I felt completely out of my depth. I had no idea what I was supposed to do. I could hear people whispering around me, and I just felt so awkward, like everyone was watching me and judging me for being with her. Eventually, the cops escort Claire to the car, and the doorman turns to me, looking at me like I'm some kind of idiot for being involved with her. The embarrassment hits me like a ton of bricks, and I just want to disappear. I don't even know what to do at this point. I'm standing there alone, and I realize the whole night has just gone completely off the rails. There's no way I'm going to salvage this. I text her, telling her I hope she's okay. But at this point, I'm not even sure if I want to hear back from her. Needless to say, I never saw Claire again. The whole thing was just so messed up that I don't think I'll ever forget it. A date that started with excitement ended in total disaster. I learned the hard way that you can't always predict how things will go, especially when you're dealing with someone who has no problem breaking every rule in the book. I guess the takeaway here is, maybe don't go for a fancy dinner with someone who shows up in a tracksuit. Or, I don't know, maybe check their temper before agreeing to anything. Okay, this is going to sound insane, but it's 100% true, and it still messes with me to this day. I met Hamad through mutual friends. He seemed cool at first. He was charming, funny, and all-around good company. We'd been texting for a while, and eventually we decided to meet up in person. I was pretty excited about it, I'll admit. It's not every day that you get to go out with someone you've been chatting with for a while. We went to this small cafe near the park, nothing fancy, but the vibe was nice, and the food was decent. I was feeling pretty relaxed, and it seemed like the date was going well. We talked about the usual stuff, hobbies, movies, travel, and I found myself getting more comfortable around him. At one point, as we were sipping our drinks, Hamat mentioned that he had a gift for me. I was a little surprised since we hadn't really talked about gifts or anything like that, but I was curious. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small wrapped package. It wasn't anything too big, maybe the size of a shoebox, and it was wrapped in simple brown paper. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh, it's just a small token of affection, right? Well, that's what I thought too at first. He handed it to me with a kind smile and said, I thought you might like this. I carefully tore off the wrapping, and inside was a doll. But not any doll, a handmade one that looked way too much like me. It wasn't like a normal doll, though. This thing was weird. It had these odd, exaggerated features: big eyes, a stitched mouth, and this strange, almost sinister expression on its face. And the thing that really creeped me out, it looked just like me, but it was wrong. Like, the proportions were off, and the skin color was slightly off too. It was made of fabric, but it had this texture that felt like rough, old cloth. I could tell it was made with care, but there was something unsettling about it. I tried to laugh it off, not sure how to react. I thought maybe it was some quirky thing he thought I would appreciate. I mean, people have different tastes, right? But when I looked at Hamad, I could tell the way he was looking at me that he expected me to love it. His eyes were wide with excitement, and he was waiting for my reaction. I asked him where he got it, but his answer was vague, like he didn't really want to talk about it. He just said he found it in an antique shop and thought it would be something special. I told him I appreciated the gift, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to focus on the conversation again, but it wasn't long before I noticed something strange. The doll felt heavy in my hands, almost like it was alive. Every time I looked at it, it seemed to stare back at me with those hollow eyes, and I swear it felt like it was moving. Like, when I glanced down, I'd notice its position shift just a little bit. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my imagination, but after a few minutes I couldn't take it anymore. I placed the doll down on the table, hoping that would help, but no, it felt like it was watching me. Hamad didn't seem to notice, though. He kept chatting away like everything was normal, but I kept feeling like something was off, like there was something he wasn't telling me. As the night went on, things started to get more unsettling. Every time I would glance at the doll, it felt like its expression changed. It was almost like the stitches on its mouth were pulling tighter, like it was smiling at me in a way that made my skin crawl. And the eyes, those eyes, felt like they were following me, no matter where I went. At one point, I had to step outside to get some fresh air. I didn't tell Hamed why, but I just needed to clear my head. When I came back, the doll was sitting upright on the chair next to me, but I knew I hadn't placed it there. I had put it on the table earlier, and now it was, somehow, in a different position. I tried to laugh it off again. Maybe Hamed moved it when I wasn't looking, but it didn't feel like that. It felt intentional. And that's when I started to get this weird, creeping sense of dread. I didn't know what it was about the doll, but I knew that I didn't want it near me anymore. But when I looked at Hamed, he was watching me like he was waiting for something. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about him felt off. I asked if he was sure he wanted to give me the doll, but he just smiled and said, "It's yours now. Take care of it." The way he said it gave me the chills, like it was something I was meant to have, something that I couldn't escape from. I didn't know how to get out of there without being rude, so I stayed a little longer. But my mind was racing, and I kept feeling the urge to leave. The doll had this dark energy around it, and I could feel it seeping into me. I knew I couldn't take it home. It wasn't just a doll, it was something else. As the date wrapped up, I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I thanked Hamad for the gift, but I could barely look at him. I made an excuse about having to leave early, grabbed my coat, and bolted. I didn't even look back. That night, I left the doll in my car. I didn't even want to bring it inside. I didn't know what it was, but I had this nagging feeling that it wasn't just a weird gift. I didn't know what Hamad's deal was, but I had a strong sense that something wasn't right. After that night, I couldn't bring myself to reach out to Hamad. I didn't know if I was being paranoid, but I felt like I was being watched. Every time I saw the doll, it felt like it was drawing me in, like it had some kind of power over me. So I ended up just leaving it in the back of my closet and avoiding it. Eventually, I had to throw the doll away. I couldn't take any more. It's been months since that night, but I still can't shake the memory of that creepy doll. It still freaks me out to think about it, and I haven't talked to Hamed since. If you ask me, that doll wasn't just a weird gift. It was a warning, and I'm glad I got out of there when I did.